Let us get into this because the Indiana Fever just dropped a series of roster decisions that demand a serious, thorough, and completely honest examination. This is not the kind of news you skim past and move on from. These moves carry real implications, real consequences, and real questions about the direction of one of the most scrutinized franchises in professional basketball right now. So let us slow down, lay it all out precisely, and talk about what it actually means. The confirmed news is this. The Indiana Fever have officially waived 3 players ahead of the regular season. Megan McConnell, Kiana Traylor, and Jessica Timmings have all been released from the roster. Those 3 cuts bring Indiana's standard roster down to 12 players. Simultaneously, Justine Pasco has been signed to one of the 2 available developmental pool spots, locking her into the organizational structure heading into the season opener, and the Fever still have 1 developmental spot remaining that has not yet been filled, which means this roster story is not entirely finished. There is still one more chapter to be written in the coming hours and days. Let us take each piece of this separately because collapsing them into a single narrative would obscure the distinct importance of each individual situation. We begin with Justine Pasco because she deserves the recognition before anything else is discussed. She made this roster. She competed through training camp and the preseason. She demonstrated enough value in the process that the organization decided keeping her in the building was the right call, and she earned a developmental contract as a result. That is a real achievement. For everyone who watched her work and wondered whether the Fever would see what she was showing them, the answer is now official and on record. Pasco is part of this team. The developmental contract designation does not diminish that. It is a legitimate professional basketball contract with a legitimate professional basketball organization, and she earned every word of it. That deserves a moment of genuine acknowledgement before we move into the more complicated conversations this day has generated. Now let us talk about the 3 players who were waived, because understanding the full context of their situations is essential to evaluating whether the Fever made the right calls, the wrong calls, or something in between that will only be fully understood later. Megan McConnell, Kiana Traylor, and Jessica Timmings were all on training camp contracts entering the preseason. According to the available reporting, all 3 were among the players most consistently outside the rotation across Indiana's 3 preseason games. The minutes they received came largely in second-half situations against opposing bench units, which is the professional basketball equivalent of a limited audition under limited pressure. That context matters when assessing what was and was not demonstrated during their time in camp. It is not a full picture. It is a partial one, and partial pictures sometimes lead to decisions that look different 6 months later than they did on the day they were made. The Megan McConnell situation is the one that requires the most careful handling because her professional profile is genuinely more substantial than a simple training camp cut would suggest. McConnell is not an unknown. She is not a player arriving at an NBA or WNBA adjacent facility for the first time with nothing but potential and hope on her resume. She is the sister of TJ McConnell, the Indiana Pacers point guard, and more importantly, she spent the most recent winter in Australia playing in the WNBL, which is one of the most competitive women's professional leagues in the world outside of the WNBA itself. During that time overseas, she averaged 11 points, 6.2 rebounds, and 3.9 assists per game while receiving consistent, meaningful playing time in a real competitive environment. Those are not camp statistics inflated by playing against second and third string competition in controlled settings. Those are numbers produced against professional players in a league that takes the game seriously. They tell you something real about what McConnell can do when given the opportunity to actually play. She arrived at Indiana's training camp with that recent professional production behind her, competed for a roster spot, and was ultimately cut. The decision came down to her versus Justine Pasco for the developmental spot that Pasco ultimately received. The Fever chose Pasco, and that choice is defensible given what Pasco showed. But cutting McConnell entirely, releasing her into the waiver pool rather than finding a way to keep both players in the organizational structure is the part of this that generates legitimate second-guessing. Because a player who just averaged 11 points and over 6 rebounds per game in professional competition overseas is not a player you simply let walk without at least some concern that another organization is going to benefit from what you decided to release. And that leads directly to the next critical element of this story. Once McConnell, Traylor, and Timmings clear the waivers process, which operates on a 24-hour window, every franchise in the WNBA has the ability to claim any of them and add them to their own roster. That means the players Indiana just released are, for the next day, available to anyone who sees enough value to make a move. Given McConnell's demonstrated professional productivity in Australia, the realistic expectation is that she attracts genuine interest from teams who have done their homework on what she produced in the WNBL this past winter. If she gets claimed by another franchise and goes on to contribute meaningfully during the regular season, the Fever's decision to release her entirely rather than retain her on their second developmental spot becomes a much more complicated thing to explain. Speaking of that second developmental spot, the reporting suggests that Indiana is likely to sign one of the 3 waived players to fill it once the waivers process concludes. McConnell's name has been the one most prominently connected to that possibility in the conversations surrounding these moves. If the Fever's intention was always to bring her back on a developmental deal after clearing waivers, then the calculus of this whole situation looks different. But if another team claims her off waivers before Indiana gets the opportunity to execute that plan, the Fever will have lost a player with genuine professional value through a process they set in motion themselves. That is a situation the organization needs to manage carefully and quickly. Kayana Traylor is another name that deserves more than a passing mention in the context of these cuts. The analytical case for Traylor is straightforward and honest. She made the most of the limited opportunities she was given during the preseason. She shot the basketball very well from three-point range when she was on the floor. She did not receive abundant minutes. She was not inserted into high-leverage situations where her ceiling was fully tested. But in the time she was given, she was efficient, she competed, and she produced at a rate that suggests her offensive value may be higher than her preseason usage indicated. Players who shoot the ball at a high clip from distance in professional settings, even limited ones, tend to find their way back into professional situations one way or another. Traylor's waiver process will be worth monitoring. Now let us have the larger conversation because these roster moves do not exist in isolation. They exist within a broader context that has been building throughout the entire preseason, and that context raises questions about this franchise's direction that are more important than any individual transaction. Stephanie White is the head coach of the Indiana Fever. She is not going anywhere. Let that be stated plainly and on record. The organization is behind her. Her players are behind her. Caitlin Clark has demonstrated a clear positive relationship with her head coach throughout camp and throughout the preseason, including moments captured publicly that show a genuine working bond between the two. None of that is manufactured or ambiguous. The relationship appears real and functional, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. But here is the thing about honest analysis. It does not stop at the comfortable part. It goes all the way to the edge and looks over. And when you look over the edge of the Stephanie White coaching conversation, what you find is a track record that contains a specific recurring limitation that has shown up consistently enough across her tenure, not just in Indiana, but across the full history of her work as a head coach, to be treated as a defining characteristic rather than a random fluctuation. She gets close. That is the honest summary. She constructs competitive teams. She develops players. She builds cultures that players genuinely want to be part of. And then, at the moment when close is no longer enough and the only acceptable outcome is finishing, something falls short. It has happened repeatedly. Not once, not twice, but across enough seasons and enough opportunities that attributing it to bad luck or unfortunate circumstances is no longer a credible analytical framework. The pattern is the evidence, and the pattern says that the one thing missing from her coaching portfolio is the ability to cross the finish line when the stakes are at their absolute maximum. The comparison to Sandy Brondello surfaces in this conversation for a reason that is not accidental. Brondello, during her coaching tenure, demonstrated the specific ability that White has not yet shown at the highest level. She could finish. She could push a team past the threshold that separates a deep run from a championship. The decision to move on from Brondello in New York is one that the Liberty organization may spend the next several years reconsidering, because coaches who know how to close are not interchangeable commodities that you replace whenever roster dissatisfaction or internal friction pushes you toward a change. They are genuinely rare, and what makes a coach capable of closing at the championship level is not something that can be installed through a new system or a new staff. It is either demonstrated in the record or it is not. White's record has not yet demonstrated it. That is the honest truth, stated with full respect for everything else she does well. And now, sitting directly on top of all of that coaching conversation comes the scheme information that Sophie Cunningham put on the record during the preseason. She stated clearly that the Fever's offensive design is built around getting Kelsey Mitchell to her left side. That the plays are structured with that as the primary objective, not as one element within a broader system, not as a read that Clark might choose when the defense presents it, as the designed outcome that the offense is constructed to create. Stop. Read that again. And then ask yourself a genuinely uncomfortable question. In what coherent offensive philosophy does it make sense to engineer your entire attack around a single player's preferred direction of movement when Caitlin Clark is on your roster? This is not an argument against Kelsey Mitchell as a basketball player. Mitchell is a legitimate professional with real scoring ability and genuine value to any roster she inhabits. The argument is not about her quality. The argument is about the decision to make her the centerpiece of a designed offensive system when the most dangerous weapon this team possesses is Caitlin Clark's ability to read a defense in real time and distribute the basketball to whoever the defense leaves open. That skill, Clark's capacity to process the game faster than defenders can adjust and find the right play in the right moment, is what makes her so exceptionally difficult to contain. It is not replicable. It is not something you scheme around. It is something you scheme through. You build the system to activate it, to put her in positions where her decision-making becomes the primary threat the defense has to account for, and then you let her attack whatever they give. When you pre-engineer the outcome of the offense before the play is run, you eliminate the unpredictability that makes Clark's game so punishing for opposing defenses. You hand every coaching staff in the league a scouting report that writes itself. You tell them, this is where we are going, this is what we want to create, now stop it. And at the playoff level, against the defensive coordinators who have been preparing for this team since the preseason, a predictable offense is a containable offense. That is not a theory. It is a consequence. It shows up every year in the playoff rounds where teams that were dominant in the regular season suddenly look mechanical and stoppable because their opponents have had enough time to map the patterns and close the lanes. The broader commitment embedded in this offensive philosophy is also something that cannot be overlooked. By designing the system around Mitchell's preferred movements, the Fever are making a statement about which player they are building around in a fundamental structural sense. And that statement stands in a complicated relationship with everything this franchise has invested in Caitlin Clark. Clark is the reason this team has the national profile it has. Clark is the reason the seats are filled and the television numbers are what they are and the merchandise moves and the conversation around the Fever is as elevated as it has been in years. Building an offense that routes through someone else's specific tendencies rather than through Clark's decision-making capacity is a choice that requires a genuinely thorough explanation, and that explanation has not yet been provided in any public forum. The Fever's standard roster sits at 12 players. Pasco holds one developmental spot. One developmental spot remains open. 3 players are moving through waivers. One of them, in all likelihood McConnell, may be brought back to fill that final developmental position once the window closes. Or another team claims her first and the conversation changes. All of it, the roster decisions, the developmental contracts, the waiver considerations, sits inside the larger framework of a franchise that has enormous talent at the top, genuine questions in the middle about scheme and philosophy, and a head coaching situation that is stable on the surface, but carries unresolved questions about the ceiling that will only be answered when the pressure is at its highest in the final months of the competitive calendar. 12 players. One developmental spot filled, one to go, and a season that begins with the weight of enormous expectations pressing down on every decision made between now and whenever this team's playoff run either continues past where it has stopped before or ends in the same place it has ended too many times already. The roster is nearly set, the scheme has been communicated, the coaching staff is in place. What comes next is the part that cannot be controlled by transactions or press releases or training camp videos. What comes next is basketball, real basketball, against real competition, in games that count and moments that reveal character and decisions that determine whether this team finally gets over the hump or whether June arrives with the same familiar feeling of a season that got close and then stopped. The truth about this Indiana Fever team will be written on the floor. Not in the transaction wire, not in the developmental contract announcements. On the floor, in the fourth quarter, when the game is close and the right call has to be made right now. That is where the answers live, and that is where we are all about to find out exactly what this franchise is made of when it matters most.